dear guests, dear colleagues, I have an honor to preside this last session of our scientific conference, and we have two more lectures to hear. The first lecture is going to Brussels tonight is our very esteemed colleague from the Orthodox Theological Faculty, Andreј Šaguna, from Lучiјan Blaga University from Sibињ, Romania, our esteemed colleague, Professor Kipriјan Toroцкај, who is going to present his paper called Byzantium after Byzantium, Byzantine Heritage in Romanian Culture. Professor Toroцкај, please.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm second time in Focci and I feel great. I will try to be short because we are all tired. Don't worry, I succeed. I have all the time success because I have a wife and 3 children, and sometimes it's enough to make this and this and this. So, about my paper, the right title is Byzantium after or against Byzantium, the Byzantine heritage in Romanian culture. My study is based on the theory of the historian Nicolae Iorga, according to which Romanian culture and civilization are deeply influenced by the Byzantine civilization. For Iorga, Byzantium means a continuity of the late ancient world and its survival in the modern world, even after the fall of Constantinople. Thus, there is a real Byzantium and an ideal Byzantium, which continues until the threshold of the 19th century. Byzantine continuity is threefold: political, civilizational, and human. This thesis has been taken up and developed further. However, there were also voices that challenged it, such as that of Daniel Barbu, another Romanian historian, who put forward the thesis Byzantium against Byzantium. The issue is not strictly theoretical, so as a case study, I will analyze the concept of retrofuturism, which sounds a little bit strange, but we will see what it means, promoted in Romanian architecture as Byzantium after Byzantium after Byzantium. So, first part, Byzance après Byzance. In a lecture held in March 1939 at the Free University, the most important Romanian historian, Nicolae Iorga, asked the question, what is Byzantium? His answer was intended to go beyond previous reductionist perspectives, namely those strictly related to archaeology or philology. The answer also had to overcome certain preconceptions and misconceptions, according to which Byzantium was synonymous with the so-called Ba Empire, the later Roman Empire, characterized by a state of degeneration, of cultural spiritual corruption, from which it was saved, admittedly only for a short time, by the Crusaders who conquered Constantinople in 1204. After that, Byzantium returned to its origins in a dark, religious, fanatical, exclusivist form. These preconceptions are due to the Enlightenment, which saw deeply religious Byzantium as a target. Edward Gibbon's famous work is an eloquent example of this. A change of perspective only came about through the work of a historian like Charles Dier, to which other scholars such as the Germans Krumbacher and Dölger have been aided. They went beyond the previous reductionist perspectives and put Byzantium back in its rightful place as a great historical fact. The definition proposed by Orga sounds, and I quote, Byzantium is a synthesis of very particular elements coming from everywhere, which always remains open until the Byzantine idea itself has disappeared. This definition, therefore, combines both a static and a dynamic aspect. The elements that make up the Byzantine synthesis with its claim to universality are, first, Roman law, second, orthodoxy, and third, the Orient. All these elements are incorporated into a civilization which is, on the one hand, united with Greco-Roman antiquity, hence with the West, and on the other side with the Eastern European world, which includes the ecumenical patriarchate even under Islamic domination. The Romanian historian's vision is holistic. What is important is the line of continuity between Eastern and Western Christianity, or between Byzantium and Eastern Christianity. To what extent were the Romanian countries part of the Byzantine Commonwealth of which Dimitri Obolescu spoke? In his opinion, the answer can only be positive if the interests of both sides are taken into account. Thus, on the one hand, with the shaking of Hungarian domination, of Valahai in 1330, of Moldavia in 1365, the Romanian rulers had acquired enough power, ambition, independence, and wealth to think of increasing their prestige at home and their status abroad by cementing ties with the empire. I quote, "They did not need to look for examples in the behavior of the rulers of Eastern Europe in the past to know that the first step towards the desired path was to obtain a church organization under the auspices of Byzantium." On the other hand, there are at least three main reasons why the Byzantines were interested in the Romanian countries. One, trade. Two, the ambition of the ecumenical patriarch to consolidate and extend his hegemony in Eastern Europe. And above all, three, military, given the desire to stop the threat of the Turks and Valahai, and to a lesser extent Moldova, to the relations they had with the neighboring province of Transylvania, could play an active role in the crusades played at Buda. But what was the situation after 1453? Returning to Nicolae Iorga's vision, he pointed out that, I quote, "Byzantium goes far beyond the year 1453, when Constantinople was taken over by Mohammed II, and the Byzantine idea now passes to certain peoples of southeastern Europe, settling for, sometimes in our country, with all its elements of art, political concept, and law, but it also preserved in Constantinople, where the Patriarch is nothing but a continuator of the Byzantine imperials of yesteryear, bearing as proof of his role the Byzantine eagle on his breast and gathering at the great feast of Christianity, not only the whole Greek world there, but the whole Orthodox conscience of Eastern peoples, surrounding him with a respect that went as far as the Russia of the Romanovs, linked to the Greek world by this Orthodox community. Second part, Byzantium against Byzantium. This thesis has been taken up and developed further. There were, however, voices which, with partially taking up Iorga's demonstration, expressed reservation about his general thesis. For example, almost half a century after the conference held at the Byzantinology Congress in Sofia, 1934, Valentin Alexandru Georgescu wrote that this I don't know exact term, Felix formula, Byzance après Byzance, Byzantium after Byzantium, was intended to show that the peoples of southeastern Europe, especially the Romanians, could only define themselves with the precious help of Byzantium, beyond and often against it, with the aim of forging their own non-Byzantium. For this part, Andreј Pipidi, he is a nephew of Iorga, expressed some reservation in the sense that the Romanians would have used some Byzantine forms to express a background which, on closer inspection, would turn out to be non-Byzantine. An analysis of political Byzantinism in Romanian history finds itself in the difficult position of balancing the temptation to consider Byzantium as a forceful idea that effectively animated the institutional structure of domestic politics on the one hand, and on the other, the reservation to place the same Byzantium in the category of a cultic tradition that did not transmit the past, but created. There were also specific, indigenous, autochthon elements that were interwoven not only with external Byzantine derived elements, but also with external Western elements. And the role of the latter cannot be neglected. Byzantium after Byzantium after Byzantium, retrofuturism. The discussion on this topic is not purely theoretical. It is also has direct, practical implication for the culture of the Romanian people. I would like to mention here the work of an architect, Ioan Augustin, who is professor at the University of Architecture and Planning in Bucharest. A prolific author, he has written several books and studies, including one entitled Byzantium after Byzantium after Byzantium. The concept promoted by the author is that of retrofuturism, or mixture, eine Mischung of old and new. Patristic doctrinal renewal is here coupled or doubled with a concrete architectural one. Here is what Professor Ioan Augustin wrote. The paradox, a paradox that is gratifying, of Christian architecture, apologized by the Church, is that it must be both archaic and futuristic. The inspired recapitulation of the bimillennial tradition is one of its aims, but at the same time, the expectation of the second coming makes the Church a place oriented not only in the proper cardinal sense of the term, but also in its temporal sense. Investigating tradition uncovers things far enough back in time and surprising enough to make the unusual happen, not in the sense of invention, but of rediscovery. Unusuality, the word in Romania is in isolation, a very strange word. It means of drawing attention to the work of logos in the world. The Church must be, architecturally speaking, both a perpetual recapitulation and an unremitting experimental investigation of the Christian tradition. The placing in contemporary context and the rewriting of these elements located in their own tradition make the reiteration a good school of composition and the resulting architecture at once old and new. In conclusion, the discussion is still open. It is not without its supporters and in the same time opponents. For example, Ioan Augustin won the national competition for the Patriarchal Cathedral dedicated to the Ascension of the Lord and Saint Andrew the Apostle in 2002. The project was published in a book and can be accessed on the internet. However, another project was finally put into practice by the current Patriarch Daniel, but the gustibus non disputabil. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Toroцкај, for your contribution and really deep insight into the very known expression Byzantium after Byzantium from from the world in which this sentence was firstly said from the Romanian history and heritage. Now, last but not the least, is our dear colleague and esteemed Professor Vedran Goliјanin from our faculty here, who is going to present us his paper called Byzantine Heritage and Orthodox Mission Today. Please take it.
Thank you very much. Reverend Fathers, esteemed guests and colleagues. In its missionary activity, the Church presents itself as the carrier of truth and the witness of God's revelation. But over the centuries, it has also presented itself as a carrier of culture. It simultaneously Christianizes and civilizes. Greco-Roman civilization was largely Christianized by the 7th century, when the Muslim conquerors prevented Christianity's advance towards the south, so the only possible direction of Christian spread remained north. People then located north of the Greco-Roman civilization's borders were on the lower stages of cultural development, meaning their Christianization also entailed cultural transplantation. Just 1 century ago, the Orthodox Church had an extremely advanced missionary movement, especially in Russia. If we compare the situation back then with our current state of affairs, we will come to the unpleasant conclusion that our mission is practically paralyzed. During the past century, Orthodoxy appeared in Africa, America, and India, although most of these conversions were not the result of Orthodox missionaries' activity, but that of non-Orthodox Christians' search for the authentic form of Christianity. There are many reasons for Orthodox missionary stagnation, including often mentioned material and educational problems, as well as the supposed nationalism of local, national churches, which allegedly inhibits Orthodox mission in general. However, the real cause of this problem is the bewildering lack of interest in mission among the Orthodox. Even our civilization is largely defeated by a postmodernist indifference towards the truth, meaning that the mission is required even in our immediate environment. With these facts in mind, we must ask whether the so-called traditional Byzantine missionary method is still relevant, or do we need a different strategy? The history of Byzantine missions contains several magnificent episodes that decisively influenced the development of the general Orthodox missionary method, but also several periods of missionary passivity that made the Eastern missionary movement apparently much weaker than the Western. Besides historical and geographical reasons for more deficient missionary results in the East, the historian of missions, Kenneth Scott Latourette, mentions the fact that the specific relationship of church and state in Byzantium has, to a certain degree, restricted the missionary impulse. Rome was able to initiate the missions independently, while the Byzantine Church's missionary efforts mainly depended on the state initiative. The same Byzantine practice was later upheld in the Russian Empire. Therefore, during its 2 golden ages, Byzantine and Russian, the Orthodox mission depended on the initiative and support of the Christian state, which somewhat explains its modern stagnation. The traditional Byzantine or Orthodox missionary method, as usually indicated in missiological literature, was formed in the 9th century at the time of St. Cyril and Methodius' mission among the Slavs. Many modern missiologists state that a strong accommodational approach characterized Cyril and Methodius' mission, for which we can consider them the forerunners of what is today called inculturation. Indeed, the missionary method of St. Cyril and Methodius shows many elements of inculturation, that is, the Church's acceptance and sanctification of local culture. This requires, in the first place, the usage of the mother tongue in preaching and worship, as made possible by the Saint Brothers' devising of the Slavic alphabet and their translation of church literature into the Slavic language. Nevertheless, the Church's acceptance of local language is still not a true inculturation. It is also necessary to prevent the so-called spiritual colonialism, the domination of foreign clergy, through a process known as indigenization. This means that the local community, with its domestic leadership, has the primary responsibility and task to develop the theology, worship, and practice of the local church. As James Stamoulis claims, Cyril and Methodius' mission contains key elements inherent in all Orthodox missions. In other words, their missionary method became the ideal for all later Byzantine and Orthodox missions in general. However, this missionary ideal was rarely practiced. Byzantium was supportive of Cyril and Methodius' work in Great Moravia, but in the Balkans, As George Ostrogorsky notices, the Byzantine Church was a powerful factor in the Hellenization of the Slavic populace. Dmitry Obolensky claims that Cyril and Methodius were the embodiments of Christian universalism, while simultaneously warning us not to idealize Byzantine universalism. Besides the Hellenization of Slavs on the empire's territories, a number of Byzantine clergymen were, according to Obolensky, unsympathetic toward the idea of liturgy in the Slavic language. In other words, they supported the so-called trilingual heresy. Just like all other heresies, this one also has a deeper dimension. It is not just a glorification of mere three languages, but an unjustified idea of the superiority of Greek, Latin, and, at least in theory, Hebrew cultures over the so-called barbarian cultures. As we shall see, the Orthodox missionary activity was never completely liberated from all the particles of the trilingual heresy. Its surface layer was mostly eradicated, and most nations today have liturgy in their languages. However, its deeper dimension, the idea of cultural superiority, still exists in our missionary practice and, to a certain degree, even in Orthodox neo-patristic theology. Historically, the Slavs have accepted Byzantine culture and combined it with their cultural heritage. This process led to the birth of civilization, with its Byzantine ecclesiastical foundation becoming the Orthodox culture. In the minds of the Orthodox, this culture became the visible sign of religious unity and apparently something mandatory for all nations who wish to accept the Orthodox faith. But this cultural Byzantism, which sometimes considers Byzantine cultural heritage equivalent to the truth of revelation, has effectively prevented the enculturation in all future missions. For that reason, we might say that the missionary method of Cyril and Methodius was indeed ideal, but it was certainly not the traditional Byzantine or Orthodox method of mission. Saint Stephen of Perm, a 14th century Russian missionary and one of the most worthy successors of Cyril and Methodius, devised the alphabet for a Finno-Ugric people, Syrians, and translated the liturgy into their language. But after his death, the Syrian Christian culture was cancelled and replaced by a Christianized Russian culture. Commenting on this mission, George Florovsky stated that, I quote, "Not all people possess their own culture or indeed can possess it, and that can or cannot is a bare historical fact," end of quote. But what makes the people able to possess a culture? Also, why were the Slavs in Moravia, who just like Syrians were illiterate and culturally undeveloped people, able to maintain their own culture while Syrians did not have the same possibility? It is evident that the Russian state treated the Syrians like Byzantium treated the Slavs in its territories. The latter carried out the Hellenization and the former Russification. In both cases, we see a cultural imposition, which cannot possibly come to terms with enculturation as enacted by Cyril and Methodius, nor can it be justified by suspicious theories about the impossibility of independent cultural life of certain nations. Nonetheless, the problem is much bigger than the historical enforcement of foreign culture upon Byzantine Slavs or Russian Syrians. Inside Orthodoxy, far away from mission areas, there exists a dominant idea of the unquestionable authority of Byzantine Hellenism, which crept its way into Orthodox theology through a neo-patristic renaissance. This idea might seem wholly justified and logical in our cultural and theological context, but all its problematic aspects are immediately apparent precisely in the mission field. The cause of this problem is a presupposition that nobody can become Orthodox Christian unless they have previously adopted the Hellenistic, Byzantine way of thinking. While criticizing the ways of Russian theology, Florovsky claims that Hellenism, which in his thought is primarily Byzantine, has become, I quote, "the eternal category of Christian existence," end of quote. Orthodox dogmas were formulated on the basis of revelational truth, but they were expressed in the Greek language, that is, in the language of Greek philosophy. It is possible to suppose that what we have here is just one of the contextual theologies, or at least one important stage in theology's development, but neo-patristic theology does not approve of such an understanding of Christian Hellenism. Comparing theology and philosophy to sciences like mathematics, geometry, and physics, Vladan Perišić concludes that there is no Greek, Australian, or Serbian geometry. There is only geometry. Therefore, there can be no contextual theology, such as Greek or Serbian, but only theology. Perišić then adds that, I quote, rationality should be understood as a God's gift to humankind, and owing to God's providence, it was developed in ancient Greece exactly at that time in order to be the proper context for the theology which would come after it and explain the revealed truths. End of quote. Perišić essentially elaborates on Florovsky's statement that, I quote, "The good news in Christian theology once and for all were expressed from the start in Hellenistic categories." End of quote. There are a few questionable moments in this glorification of Hellenism. Firstly, neither philosophy nor theology can be equated with the exact sciences like mathematics or physics. Exact sciences are not culturally conditioned, while philosophy and theology always have a cultural frame. Additionally, rationality is not exclusively Greek, but a universal human quality, which makes the idea of sole Greek philosophy's ability to rationally explain the truth of revelation hardly acceptable. The same human rationality is the foundation of Indian and Chinese schools of philosophy. Still, these are usually discarded or ignored without serious study of their potential to become the proper context for theology in other civilizations. The theory of Hellenistic or Byzantine cultural supremacy was not accepted by all Orthodox philosophers and theologians. The common element of all these critics of neo-patristic theology is not a doubt in the Church Fathers' authority, but in the fossilization of their theology's cultural frame, without contextualization. Florovsky himself has claimed that theology is not a mere reference to fathers, but the actualization of their mind or spirit. Without patristic theology, there would be no Christianization of Hellenism, which is just another way of describing the inculturation of Christianity in Hellenistic culture. Therefore, the actualization of the mind of the fathers is not just the recycling of their conclusions, but the application of their methods in the modern church's life, including mission. The work of Cyril and Methodius was also conducted in accordance with the patristic mind. They have approached the Slavic yet unchristianized culture as something worthy of sanctification, not trying to restrict the Holy Spirit's breathing in the Slavic church by means of strict parental control. Unfortunately, the history of Orthodox missions shows that missionaries have mostly carried out cultural imposition rather than inculturation. What remained of the elements of the Byzantine heritage was the reliance on the state and the feeling of the cultural superiority of Orthodox, that is, Byzantine culture, which produced rather meager missionary results outside of Orthodox countries. The most important Orthodox missions in the modern age were aimed at East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea. In this part of the world, for the first time after the Christianization of Hellenism, the Orthodox faced highly developed cultures with their own philosophical heritage, meaning that the imposition of Byzantine Hellenism was out of the question. The Church should have initiated the inculturation, similar to the Christianization of Hellenism in the early Christian age. Instead of following Cyril and Methodius and believing that the Holy Spirit can sanctify East Asian cultural and philosophical heritage, many Orthodox missionaries have ignored or openly anathematized it. This is evident in the translations of the first words of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Logos. The logical choice of the Semitic philosophical term to translate the Logos is Dao, which would have opened the door for the development of authentic East Asian Orthodox terminology. Unfortunately, the Orthodox translators of the Bible have rejected this term, both because of its Taoist origins and the fact that it was used by the Protestants. Guri Karpa relied on the earlier Roman Catholic translation, and thus he translated the Logos as Shenyan, holy word, while Innocent Figurovsky used the term Yan, word. On the other hand, while translating the Bible into Japanese, Saint Nicholas Kasatkin translated Logos as Kotoba, which also means word, avoiding the usage of Do, which is Japanese equivalent to Chinese Dao. Neither of these terms has a metaphysical meaning like Logos had in Hellenism. That is how the Orthodox have unfortunately thwarted the sanctifying dialogue between the Church and East Asian cultures and philosophies, simultaneously preventing the part of indigenization that refers to developing theology in the local church. The fact is that the Orthodox do not have any notable theologians from this part of the world who are comparable to Kazo Kitamori, Shoki Ko, Zhao Zerchen, K.T. Ting, etc. Some Orthodox have approached the East Asian peoples just as they have approached the illiterate tribes, thus creating in this part of the world spiritual colonies, communities that even today are not able, or not allowed to, exist independently without constant parental supervision from Europe. In this way, some Orthodox have failed to implement the second part of indigenization, establishing local clergy that is supposed to take over the administration of the community after the missionaries' departure. The practice of appointing foreign bishops, that is, of spiritual colonialism, is not a thing of the past. We might consider the example of Korea, where the Russian mission started in 1900 and lasted until the Korean War, when Russian missionaries were expelled. The Ecumenical Patriarchate then put Korea under its jurisdiction in 1955, sending Sotirios Trambas as a missionary in 1975. In 2004, the Ecumenical Patriarchate established the Metropolitanate of South Korea and appointed Trambas as its first metropolitan. Current Metropolitan of South Korea, another European man named Ambrosios Zographos, has the title Metropolitan of Korea and Exarch of Japan, even though there is an Orthodox Church in Japan with autonomy granted by Moscow Patriarchate in 1970 and administered by Japanese metropolitans since 1972. After the Ecumenical Patriarchate's recognition of the so-called Orthodox Church of Ukraine in 2019, the Moscow Patriarchate has again appointed its own bishop in Korea, a Korean named Theophan Kim. The Ecumenical Patriarchate's Metropolitan of Korea, Ambrosios, claims that the most significant problem of the modern Orthodox mission is a heresy of ethnophilitism. While directly criticizing the Russian Church and indirectly all other national churches, Metropolitan Ambrosios states that the alien bishops behave as conquerors who, I quote, occupy holy churches and remove native clergy from the local canonical church using immoral bait, end of quote, which is obviously directed against Bishop Theophan Kim. According to Metropolitan Ambrosios, I quote, ethnophilitism makes us heretics because we do not place Christ and his church above everything, while the language of love is of lower value than our national language and our cultural heritage, end of quote. We cannot fail to notice how the phantom of ethnophilitism serves as a justification for a textbook example of spiritual colonialism, and that is the domination of foreign white clergy over non-European Christians like in Korea. Bishop Theophan Kim, who is of Korean ancestry, is presented as alien, while the European bishop in Korea is somehow local. Cyril and Methodius were outstanding fighters against the idea of Greek and Latin cultural supremacy, that is, against the trilingual heresy, and their efforts were acknowledged through a universal recognition of their sanctity. Modern missionary practice of some Orthodox Christians is an explicit negation of Saint Cyril and Methodius' heritage. What remains of the traditional Byzantine missionary method is a feeling of cultural and spiritual superiority, and what remains of inculturation is just translation. That is why our so-called traditional method is more in line with the attitude of Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda toward American natives or Charles de Tournon toward Indians than with the attitude of Cyril and Methodius toward Slavs. Such a missionary strategy effectively prevents the Christianization of the modern world. Without indigenization, there can be no Christianization of local culture, meaning the newly formed church is unable to spread on its own, and it remains under the parental supervision of a foreign ecclesiastical center for an unspecified length of time. Every nation needs missionaries from other nations, but every nation also needs its own Saint Sava, so the word of the gospel might forever be embedded in its culture. If we are not aware of the necessity of full enculturation, or that which the concept of the missionary activity of the Russian Orthodox Church terms the ecclesiastical reception of culture, we cannot even re-Christianize our own civilization. And I'll finish soon. The same document explains the necessity of a true Orthodox mission in the spirit of Saint Cyril and Methodius, stating that the mission means, I quote, approaching the world, sanctifying and renovating it, bringing the new content into the everyday life, accepting local cultures and their expressions that do not contradict the Christian faith, and transforming them into the means of salvation, end of quote. The Church's approach to the world and culture in the spirit of Cyril and Methodius is more in accordance with the early Christian missionary method than our traditional missionary practice. For that reason, the modern Church needs another renaissance beside a neo-patristic one, and that is precisely the missionary revival. Instead of religious dependence on only one holy culture, the Church must sanctify all yet unchristianized cultures so that all of them can be as holy as our Byzantine cultural heritage. Thank you.
Now you know that we have kept our best for the end. And Thank you, Dr. Gollianin, for your brilliant presentation. Now I open floor for the questions, for the remarks, and for some conclusions. And after that we will close this scientific conference and be open for questions.
May I begin? Short remark, short question.
When a tradition is not anymore a living tradition, we have this problem. This problem is common for Orthodoxy also in Africa, not only in Asia. And my question is, do you know, I'm certain, the work of Archbishop Athanasios Ioannulatos, both in Africa and in Albania. He didn't use the method from Greeks in Africa, in Albania. He has a great success, because when we speak about renewal and when we speak about Hellenism and other terms, we don't have to forget that we are first of all Christians and not Greeks, Romanians, and so on. And when we took another elements, external elements, doesn't mean we can use in all places, in Asia, in Africa, and so on. So I remember Father Ion Bria, who was my professor, and I was a student, and he spoke about icons in Africa with Jesus black, Mary Virgin black, and I was shocked because for me was alien, so didn't see. And we can find this another tradition in every place, So we was today with my wife in the restaurant. It was an icon. It was for the first time when I saw an icon in a restaurant. My wife was shocked because thought, okay, this is, you can drink, you can smoke, and so on. It's an icon. This is not church. Okay, icons are for church in Romania. Here in Bosnia, no. So you understand, and this is only a small, a little experience. So my question, very short. Do you know these problems with Greeks and mission of Greeks in Africa? Can you tell us some words?
Yes, as for Archbishop Athanasios Ioannulatos, I think that we should, when we speak about his missiological theory and practice, we should differentiate between young Ioannulatos and older Ioannulatos, because when you read his earlier works and the most significant Orthodox missionary journal, Poetendis, we will notice the same recycled phrases about the nationalism of local churches, how the mission in China failed because of Russian nationalism, which are historically not correct facts. But as he got older, Ioannulatos, I think, realized the importance precisely of enculturation. So in his newer works, he insists on the adopting of all those local cultural elements that are not contradictory to Christian faith, which might then be used, as I said, and as also writes in the concept of missionary activity of Orthodox Russian Orthodox Church, used as the means of salvation. So Ioannulatos is probably one of the best examples of modern Orthodox missiologists who do not have that problem of realizing the importance of contextualization. As you said, wherever you go, you might see some interesting local expressions of Christianity, although I don't know how an authentic expression of our orthodoxy is the icon in Zlatna Dunja. I don't think it is. But yeah, we sometimes do that here. As for his work in Africa, as far as I know, he managed to overcome a certain problem that other Greek missionaries had, and it was also the spiritual colonialism. I will admit that I do not know the details. It is very hard to get to the relevant papers and books that describe those problems, but African Christians, who were also, by the way, not turned into Orthodoxy, converted to Orthodoxy from, I don't know, some tribal religion, but from Protestantism, also not by the work of missionaries, but through their own desire to approach the original Christianity, they then faced one of the worst problems of Orthodox mission, and that is the imposition of foreign bishops. And that's why they were rebellious for a certain amount of time. But as I am informed, that problem is mostly eradicated by this time. And I must also add that the problem of appointing foreign bishops always entails the irritation among the local people. The same situation was in China under the Russian bishops, but I think that the Russians realized that problem much earlier than other churches. For example, Ecumenical Patriarchate seemingly still does not understand that white bishop or Greek bishop in Korea is actually alien, no matter how long he stayed there. So the Russians were ready and were able to appoint Japanese bishops in Japan, Chinese bishops in China, maybe too late, but they certainly did it. So as for Africa, it is probably the most promising field of Orthodox mission now, and if we do not find some solution to adapt their cultural heritage into Orthodox faith, and that is not just allowing them to dance during the liturgy, but really accept the good elements of their ancestral cult, etc., that we will mess things up there too, as we did in East Asia.
Okay. Any more questions? No? Very short from here. No, so the lady can translate.
It's a very short question.
Just so
Okay.
maybe you can translate nicely.
It's very short. How can we use these principles in our own social context on the Balkans? Because I have the impression, a very large field for mission in our countries. I speak from our case in Macedonia, but also other countries we call Orthodox, but we have large ethnic and religious and non-religious and atheist groups, etc. Or I don't know, with other philosophical ideas, agnostic, etc. How do we use this principle in our context, not in Africa, not in East Asia, but here?
Yes, the concept of the missionary activity of Russian Orthodox Church, as opposed to the decisions of the Council of Crete, does state that the mission, or as it is termed, the re-Christianization of Europe, Western culture, of post-Christian culture, is quite necessary. So yes, it's true that we do not have to go to Africa or East Asia or India or wherever to do mission. We must do it here. That is a very complex question, and there is, I'm afraid, no possible way to answer it shortly. There is a book that I recommend that I published, actually that Father Darko insisted to be published, where I discussed in length the possibilities of re-Christianization. But I will just point at a few important elements. First of all, we must stop with the way of thinking that as Father Darko said during his lecture, or maybe some of the questions or comments, I don't know, that what we talk about in these classrooms is actually true life. It is not. I am a relatively young teacher, and whenever I speak to my former students, who are now priests or teachers of religious education, most of them, honestly, say that very little of their education here is applicable in the everyday life. That is just their experience. I stay here and I teach them, so maybe I also carry some amount of fault. I think that we should, some elements of that strategy, we should approach the modern art and to try to preach through modern art, because I think that the movies like Ostrovo Island, or I don't know the name of the movie about St. Luke or Crimea, Healing Fear, those movies certainly speak more to people who watch them than, I don't know, some boring sermon that lasts half an hour. That is probably one of the methods. And the second method is truly honest dialogue with modern science, because many smart people, let's say it like that, actually turn from Christianity when they say that we unfortunately still seriously talk about whether the earth is flat or not. And discussions about evolution or the Big Bang are actually something that we will reach probably in 100 years. So we must adapt at least to modern science and modern art in order to speak the language of modern people, because we truly have many things to offer, but we just do not have the proper means to offer. That's just my those are just my ideas. I'm sure that other people will have some other ideas as well.
May I ask Enculturation means to use the best instruments in one place. Last year, a priest held a PhD thesis about Orthodoxy in Japan. He was a priest in Japan almost 5 years. Before, he was priest in Bucharest. Bucharest is the big city, almost 3 million people there, and so on. And at a restaurant, this priest told me I thought I am a good priest. I was a good priest in Bucharest, because Bucharest is in Romania, and Romania has almost 90% Orthodox. So almost 80 told we are practicants, Orthodox, okay, everything. But in Japan, not anymore. I was an alien, and I felt that I'm not prepared to live in this world and to make a mission in this world. That means you can be a good priest in father in Bucharest, but not so good in Japan. It is not your fault. No, you are not prepared. So it's very important for Orthodoxy, Greeks, Russians, Serbian, and so on, to be prepared to go to Africa, to go to Asia, and so on, to make a real mission. Because you can be a good father in Focci, but not in Tokyo.
That's why I'm not going to Tokyo. So,
Or go prepared.
let me end with two interesting anecdotes, or one anecdote and one joke. One anecdote is really two-folded. It's very interesting that when famous Russian contemporary novelist Yevgeny Vodolazky, when he published his book, which is by the way translated into Serbian, it's called Love. When he published this book, it is generally modern retelling of hagiography by St. Xenia of St. Petersburg. The backlash after the publication was that he had many people coming to his apartment and thanking him for changing their lives because they had read one book, which is one of the best modern novels ever written. Pretty much the same thing happened with actor Peter